Yeah, this is going to be an adventure with you guys today. So lots of time for interaction. So I appreciate you guys coming. This talk is called, roughly, I change the name sometimes, The Executive's Guide to Leading Large-Scale Agile Transformations. And if anybody's listened to me talk over the last couple years or is familiar with the stuff that we're doing at Leading Agile, you'll know that we have a point of view on what does it take to actually run kind of a structured, disciplined, agile transformation. And so what this talk is, it's trying to get us specific about what does it actually take to lead these things. So again, my name is Mike Kopmeyer. This is my contact information if anybody would like to write it down. I run a company that's based out of Atlanta, Georgia called Leading Agile that is pretty exclusively focused on the mechanics of agile transformation, actually helping companies make these changes. And I've been doing this for about 7 years, and we're getting better at it, and we're learning a lot about what it takes. And one of the big challenges that we have, and I'm sure you guys have seen it, it's like a lot of times you'll get the executives engaged, but you don't necessarily get their real support, right, at the end of the day. Or maybe we're leading from the ground up, but we don't know how to influence to get the kinds of things that we need. And so what we've been trying to figure out how to do is really engage at the executive level, but then also maintain that engagement and that support by really demonstrating specific measurable progress, specific measurable outcomes on transformation. And so I've been doing this, like I said, for about 7 years, a lot of background in like financial services industry, things like that, really learning how to be a CEO of a consultancy. We're, like I said, about 60 people now. So what this talk is about, it's about how to understand and think about transformation. And so, one of the things we're going to, kind of talk a little bit about is like, what's our hypothesis around transformation? Like, what do we think is going to happen? We do these sets of things over here, and are we going to get these sets of outcomes over here on the other side? So what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to probably challenge some conventional thinking about how to go about the process of making change in large organizations. And part of that's going to be is talking about the fundamental underlying patterns of an organization that's successfully adopted Agile. And then we're also going to talk a lot about the barriers and the things that actually get in the way of doing an Agile transformation. And then I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about what I believe is the way to structure and organize transformation work. Because a lot of times we tend to think about doing a transformation as getting everybody trained and running through workshops and doing different things like that. I'm going to offer you an alternative model for what progress looks like on an Agile transformation and how we can start thinking about measuring it and tracking it. And then, again, last but not least, we're going to talk about how to plan, manage, and actually track an Agile transformation. And because we've got like so much time, I mean, it's like, this is, kind of designed to be a bit of an overview, but one as we get into these slides, you guys can like stop and ask me questions. What does that look like in real life, right? How would that apply to you, right? I mean, there's all kinds of different things we can do with an hour and 40 minutes together, right? So, okay. So this is kind of my hypothesis. I think the game has changed, right? So do you guys, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure we have speakers and coaches and things like that in here, other consultants. And so like, it seemed like everybody was asking me 5 or 6 years ago, how do I get my executives engaged in wanting to do an Agile transformation? I think the executives are mostly engaged now. I think there's not an executive that I ever talk to that doesn't want to do Agile. I think the concept of Agile, the need to be Agile, the need to have business agility has really kind of crossed the chasm. What I don't think is, I don't think the executives know how to do it, right? And I think that they're looking for guidance on what it is that we're supposed to do. I think that executives want some sort of line of sight into how the transformation is going to unfold. Okay? Have you guys ever seen, I've been talking about this cartoon a lot this week, and so it's like really present of mind, but I didn't put it in here because I didn't think about it until just now. Do you guys ever see the cartoon with the two scientists standing at the whiteboard? Or it's actually a chalkboard, it's an old cartoon. And it has like a bunch of math on one side and a bunch of math on the other side. And the one scientist that looks up, there's like a big cloud in the middle, it says, then a miracle happens here. And like the punchline at the bottom is, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2. We're kind of like saying, hey, Agile's this great thing, do this stuff, and you're going to get these outcomes, but they don't quite know how to connect the dots. Right? So a lot of this talks about how a hypothesis I have around how to connect dots. And this is another thing that I'm curious as we unfold this, what you guys think, is I think executives have to be able to economically justify the transformation as they go. So they're either hiring internal coaches, they're sending people to training, they're hiring external coaches, and either way, in some regard, we're disrupting the status quo. We have a hypothesis that if we adopt Agile, we're going to get these business outcomes. And if we're getting those business outcomes, we should be able to tie it back to dollars, right? We should be able to tie the spend back to dollars. And we're not always necessarily good at doing that. And one of the things that I've really learned is probably the biggest way we've evolved our practices is that when we're doing transformation work, we're often have to be funded by the CFO. And if the CFO is spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do something, those guys have fiscal responsibility for it, right? They're accountable for that spend. And so if they're giving us permission to go do a transformation, by us, I mean us, right? If they're giving us permission to go do a transformation, they're accountable for those dollars, right? They're accountable for that work that we're putting into the system. And so what we have to be able to do is to give them ground cover for that spend's a good spend, okay? Now, I think we have a hypothesis in the Agile community, and probably not all of us, right? But a lot of us have a hypothesis in the Agile community that we want to be able to self-organize, right? We want to be able to empower people and let them decide, okay? And that's awesome. But I imagine there's a lot of you guys, if you're in a talk like this, you're working in big, complicated, oftentimes broken organizations. And just empowering people to self-organize isn't necessarily going to get the outcomes fast enough. And so one of the things that I kind of center on is I believe in self-organization as well. But if we believe that we're just going to do something over here and then it's just going to magically happen, we have to have kind of a hypothesis for what does it look like when it's working. Because my bent is that even if we as individuals and coaches and practitioners believe in a self-organized type of transformation, it still has to be structured and planned, and there's rules of the game, right? We have to be able to tie it to those economics. The executives are not going to support it for very long if we can't figure out how to do it, okay? So I think it all ties together. I think we have to figure out how to give them line of sight, make it economically justifiable, and then give them confidence that it's just not this mystical, magical process of self-organization, empowering, and people do the right things. They will, but sometimes there's so much stuff going on in the organization that gets in the way. And that stuff is the stuff that makes doing an Agile transformation hard. And so we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit as we go for the next hour and 40 minutes. So I'm a little intimidated by having to talk to you guys for an hour and 40 minutes. I'm like, I'm going to be telling stories, and you're going to be like, is this guy ever going to get to the point? Okay. So why do executives care? This is the other thing. It's like, I did a talk at version 1. They happen to live they're in the same city as me. And so I did a user group, and I was like asking everybody, it's like, why do executives want to go to Agile? Oh, it's better, it's this, it empowers people. It's like we tend to focus on kind of like the human side of things, because we see the goodness of it, right? The culture, the interaction, right? People problem solving, right? Management getting out of the way and letting us do their work. When we go in and we're trying to pitch something to somebody, it's always in some form or fashion one of these 6 things, okay? Predictability, cost savings, getting things in market faster, the quality of the product, right? Innovation, sure, right? We want to be innovative, right? But or product fit. We want to make sure that we're building the right thing. I almost never have a conversation with anybody that doesn't, in some form or fashion, come back to one of these 6 things. And so, to develop the hypothesis a little further, if we believe Agile is going to solve for this class of problems, we kind of have to figure out what step 2 looks like. I'm going to keep saying that, right? So every time I say step 2, remember the 2 scientists standing at the chalkboard, right? Got to be more specific in step 2. So if we're going to get greater predictability, how is Agile going to help us with that? Okay? Probably going to go too deep into this slide, but it's like, so what does predictability in Agile look like? Well, we have to know our backlog, we have to know our velocity, we have to have stable velocity, we have to be able to get to a definition of done. Are we going to actually self-organize into that? I don't know, maybe not. Probably depends upon the size of the organization and the amount of organizational impediments. Okay? How is it going to improve quality? Not thematically, but specifically in your environment. How is it going to make us more innovative if this team does Agile, but they're dependent upon 46 other teams that they have to coordinate to be able to put anything into production? Right? Is Agile actually going to solve the problem? Right? If we hypothesize that we're going to do Agile and then Agile is going to break and solve all the impediments, right? Or it's going to show us the impediments to fix, have the leaders bought into fixing the impediments? Right? Don't know, right? But there's a hypothesis, implied or explicit, that if we do Agile, the business is going to get these things. Right? Is that fair? Right? It's up to us to prove that they're getting these things. Right? Okay. So what I want to go into a little bit is this idea. I've used the word hypothesis a little bit, and I almost changed the title of this slide this morning as I was going through it. And I said, so, what do you believe about transformation? In other ways, what is your hypothesis about transformation? And when I first got formally into the Agile community, I've been leading Agile for almost 7 years. Was version 1 before that for a couple years. And I started writing about this, and I started thinking about it, and I started unpacking it a little bit. What I started realizing is that a lot of times our beliefs about transformation kind of split on several lines. And the three things that I tend to see reflected in literature is that Agile's like a culture transformation. Okay, who believes that Agile's about changing your culture? Right? Okay, cool. How many people believe that Agile's about the technical practices or the daily stand-ups or the things that you do, right? Reviews, retrospectives. Right? If we teach people to do that, is that an Agile transformation? Right? A little bit, right? So the one that I don't hear people talk about that I talk about all the time, but it's deeply implied in the literature, is the systems and the organizational design that's involved. What I find fascinating was what's up underneath the Agile Manifesto, what's underneath the Scrum Guide, is this supposition that you have a small group of people that are sitting around a table with some on-site customer, product owner, something like that, and it's within their span of control to build something that they can show to that customer every couple weeks, right? That's what's up underneath it. And then the practices come along and enable it, and then the culture, the mindset stuff is what really makes it go, okay? So these three things work together, but we have a hypothesis about where to start. And my belief, I'm trying to remember the slides without looking at them because I don't want to remember, keep looking back. So if I get out of sync, you guys wave your hands at me or something. So if we believe that it's culture driven, I have a real wrestling match with the word culture, because is culture what we believe, or is it our actions? Right? When I press people into a corner and I start really pressing on what culture means, what people will say is things like, well, it's the behaviors that flow from your beliefs. I've heard people say things like, well, it's the default operating system that the company runs on, stuff like that. But to me, when we talk about it, it all comes to this this feeling of agility, this willingness to inspect and adapt, this willingness to try new things, right? And so is that culture, is it behavior, right? So I don't know, right? So culture is an interesting thing. But the question becomes, so if I say Agile's about culture change, and I encourage you to go and to change what you believe, I send you to Scrum Master training or something like that, you come back all excited about inspecting and adapting and collaborating and stuff, and then I drop you into a broken organization, right? So what'll happen is that most people, they'll get frustrated, right? Because they'll come back excited that they can change the world, and they're sitting on a mountain of technical debt. They're sitting on an organization that has incentives that are just absolutely misaligned with people collaborating with each other. They've got dependencies across the organization, right? On and on and on and on. Functional management, matrixed hierarchies, all those kinds of things. And so what we're trying to do is we're hoping beyond hope, and I'm really speaking to the large organization, right? You can do some of this stuff in smaller organizations. But if we can get everybody, all 12,000 of us, to change our minds simultaneously, right, all this stuff will just begin to emerge. Does that sound plausible to you? Okay. On top of it, the executives are like, okay, you said you're going to make us more predictable. How's this Agile stuff making us more predictable? How's it getting higher quality? Right? How's it this? How's it that? How's it helping us be more innovative? Well, Joe down here doing whatever, right? He was pretty innovative, and he's like, this guy's like going to the board of directors and talking about shareholder value, and your little team sitting down here at the bottom isn't necessarily the focus. Okay? So there's a hypothesis, and I want to be just really explicit. I don't want to make fun of it because, culture is super important. But if you lead with culture in your transformation, you have a hypothesis that those attitudes and beliefs will be sufficient for the executive to gain the business benefit that you're promising, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff in step 2 that's missing to bridge those two things, right? Because it's not just that everybody has to change their mind, then they have to go do things that lead to the outcomes. Is that fair? Right? The other side of it is when we think about it from a practices-driven perspective, let's go in and let's teach everybody how to do Scrum, right? And the underlying, I think, thinking behind that is that if we break people into teams and we get them to do sprint planning, we get them to do daily stand-ups, we get them to do reviews and retrospectives, that on the back side of that, right, I think they kind of know that the organization's broken, but the Scrum process will show you your impediments, right? The key here is that you're supposed to sit on the Scrum processes, not change them, and remove impediments. Fair? Okay? What happens in most organizations that are faced with dependencies, absent product owners, the inability to do a build, right? A lot of large organizations, we either ignore those things or we start changing Scrum to accommodate the dysfunction in the organization, right? How many people feel like they might be going through the motions of doing Scrum but aren't achieving the outcomes of doing Scrum? Oh, come on. Seriously? Okay, well, okay. I still think it's more of you. I think you guys are lying to me. So the hypothesis here is that Agile's like a way of working that will show us what's broken and that we can ultimately fix it. Okay? I personally believe that, I thought you were raising your hand for a minute. I was like, okay, maybe do a question. Yeah, so I personally believe that about 80 or 90% of the impediments to adopting Agile at scale are pretty well known before you start, right? So we don't need to pretend that we're just going to start doing Scrum and it's going to show us all these things and we're just going to fix them, right? Maybe we can fix some of them before we start, okay? And so that's what I talk about with systems. I'm going to go deep into this in a minute, but systems is about, or structure, right? Sometimes I'll say that, is about how we form teams, what we organize them around. Where are backlogs actually going to come from, right? Most organizations don't have these mythical product owners that are able to do everything across this whole stack. Some do, right? But then we have to understand how those teams roll up into larger integrated deliverables, right? Call that governance. We have to understand how we're going to balance capacity and demand. We have to understand how we're going to get the organization to focus on doing less work simultaneously, right? How is this whole thing going to work together? And so my belief really is that all three are essential. We have to have great organizational structures or systems of delivery. And then we need to enable them with processes that are actually congruent with that system of delivery. And we have to focus on hearts and minds all at the same time, right? And getting people to act with agility. And I don't think you can have any of the three absent of each other. But my bent is, and this is where I'm going to kind of start really getting into the meat of this talk, my bent is that the system stuff is actually the easiest and most quantifiable thing to tackle. If we dispel what I believe is kind of a myth that everybody has to decide locally, and we start taking a systematic approach to the architecture of the organization, that we can actually remove or diminish a lot of the impediments before we start, or at least as we're going, right, in a very systematic way, and then start training people on how to do this stuff, and then start coaching them on how to shift their attitudes once the system of delivery is congruent with what it is that we're trying to do. Okay? Anybody just think I'm just like full of crap at this point? Go for it. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, a little bit. If you get too out of hand, though, I'm gonna reel you back, but it's all good.
So in 2009, this conference was founded with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that if we adopt Agile more aggressively in Southeast Michigan, then we'll end up with better software.
Yeah.
As an effect.
Okay.
And naively, maybe even to the point of slowing down outsourcing.
Okay.
And that Southeast
Yeah.
Michigan then would be a hotbed of
Yep.
good software.
Yep, I agree.
So,
Has it happened?
well, who knows?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, who could say? Sure, yeah.
But
We're still here. We're still talking about it, right? Yeah.
well, right, and I think the conference represents the interest and commitment to that. So by that measure, by conference attendance, we can say, well, yeah, that would be an indicator that there's been some success.
So I know we have an hour and 40 minutes, but
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, right. So the question I have when you start, why would you pick systems as opposed to software? And when
So when I say systems, let me be real clear what I'm talking about with systems. Systems of delivery, right? When we're talking about one Scrum team, pretty straightforward, right? Clear backlog, dedicated team, value stream encapsulated, produce something of working tested value every sprint. Right? The reason why we're starting to see the emergence of scaled systems, SAFe, LESS, maybe disciplined agile delivery, Nexus I think is the one that scrum.org is doing. When you start trying to get into the business of coordinating teams and the output of teams across organization in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of legacy systems, in the presence of competing market demands and competing stakeholders and all the things that we're trying to manage in real companies, I believe that we have to create the context for Scrum to work. Right? Scrum is predicated that I can get a group of people operating under a single product owner and can produce something that a customer cares about. Okay? What I'm suggesting is that in most large organizations, you can't do that. You might do it in a little pocket, right? It might be great in that little pocket, but you've got 12,000 of you, right? What does that little pocket do to the goals of the executive? Well, it's a start, right? It makes those people's lives better, but that's not an enterprise story. Right? So when I'm talking about systems, right, the great software is great, but if we don't have, and I hate to use this word, but maybe it'll work here in Detroit, right? If we don't have a factory, right, if we don't have a hypothesis, I've been running around, so this is where I'm going to be like running out of time in my hour and 40 minutes, right? So like I work a lot with the Industrial and Systems Engineering College down at University of Florida. That's where I happen to go to school. And what I'm getting them to try to, what I'm thinking about is, and a metaphor I use when I talk to them a lot is think about, and this is like really loose, and I know you guys are all automotive, a lot of automotive people in here, but like think about like how a car is built, right? Ford, a lot of Ford people here, Ford isn't like trying to build everything as a one-off, right? The entire value stream of the car is not encapsulated by like a group of like 8 people like building every Ford Focus like one at a time, right? Right? It's a system, right? And you've got suppliers that are out there building subcomponents, right? And they get integrated into subsystems, and then the subsystems get integrated into harnesses, and harnesses get built on an assembly line, right? And there's this whole roll-up that if everybody's doing their piece, then what we count on is the fact that all that just in time is all going to roll up into a car, right? Fair? It's a little bit like that in software, a little bit, especially when we're doing it at scale. And so that's a system of delivery for a car. It's not like, hey, all you factory workers just go self-organize, build this stuff, and we'll just get the best possible car we could possibly get, right? There's a factory metaphor, even though it's creative and it's art, and there's all kinds of like coolness in the, but it's like that system has to do something, unless it's not going to integrate into the larger whole. So when I say systems, I'm saying, if I think about it from a manufacturing perspective, and I don't want to take that metaphor too far, there is a system of delivery in large-scale software organizations. right? And part of the problems we're getting into, and I'm going to go, again, right, probably going to go just a little too deep into this, but what makes that system work is that the person that's producing the radio or the company that's producing the radio can produce it to a spec, and then they know that when they roll it up, it's going to, they're not trying to coordinate dynamically as how to produce that radio, while the car is getting figured out, right? There's something there, right? I call it encapsulation, right? That process is encapsulated. And then the orchestration happens across the value stream, right? The delivery system. What I think most organizations that are doing software at scale, there's too much connectedness between the pieces, and too many of the decisions are operating like all over the place. And it creates swirl. So my belief is if I can figure out that metaphor, how to form teams, we're going to go deep into this, how to form teams, where decisions get made, how software gets produced, I can focus on great software in that pocket, right? But I need a pattern for how that great software is going to roll up into the bigger thing. And that's what I think is getting in the way of great software and great Scrum, is that we have messed up organizations that can't deliver great software because of all the other stuff that gets in the way. Can you buy my hypothesis for the next hour or so?
No, I don't disagree with any of it, and I don't disagree with any of the all three of them.
Yeah.
The issue at the top of the slide is where to start.
Yeah.
And the Agile Manifesto cautions us to stay focused on software as the thought and the driver and what
But here's the kicker, right? Right? So with all due respect to Alistair and Ken and all these guys, that document was written 16 years ago now for a very different context. You sit down with Alistair for any length of time, he just happens to be one of the guys that I know the best, and he'll say to you, what we were doing then is different than what we're trying to do now, right? So taking those principles in the manifesto, you can, right, in the small, but safe, to Alistair's point of view, probably isn't agile, right? Some of the stuff we're talking about here probably isn't agile as the manifesto signers intended it. Because they were thinking about, the team of 6 to 8 people sitting in a room with an on-site customer producing something of value every 2 weeks, right? The metaphor might be that small group of people that are producing the, the ignition switch for the car, right? You're not going to get that same level of face-to-face collaboration to produce the end-to-end Ford Focus, right? That's my hypothesis for the next hour. So, any questions follow on from that? You guys still tracking with me? Okay, cool.
Is your focus still primarily software, or when you say systems, you really mean like?
So when I'm talking about systems, really quick, don't get hung up. It's any kind of system, but I mean the system of delivery, okay? Well, it could be anything, right? I'm working right now with a fast food restaurant based down in Atlanta, and we're applying all the same concepts to how they figure out where buildings go, building the buildings, supply chain across the whole food delivery process, and software, right? So I don't think any of this necessarily precludes any other application areas.
Your slide is systems of delivery.
Okay. Okay. Well, the only reason why is I gave this guy permission here for a little bit. It doesn't usually cause this much conversation. So we're going to move on. So what do I mean by systems? So the 3 things. So when I very first started, this slide sequence is really kind of a build of ideas that I've fundamentally been talking about for like the last 7 or 8 years. And about 4 years ago, I did this talk I called the 3 things that you need to know to transform any size organization into an agile enterprise. Not the catchiest title in the world. So what we usually do is just call it the 3 things. And the 3 things were it's like, if I'm going to go to like the root of how Agile works, as the manifesto signers intended, and I want to get all the Agile goodness, right, in that system, and I want that team to be able to produce something of working, tested value, like every sprint, like what are my absolute non-negotiables, right? That's what I was thinking about. Because people need something simple to anchor on before they can start to build complexity. Okay? And so the 3 things that I talk about are backlogs, teams, working, tested software. And I first delivered that talk at a Scrum gathering. I want to say it was in Vegas, but I can't remember for sure. And it doesn't matter. So I did this talk, and I'm like, okay, when the Scrum guide talks about a backlog, it doesn't mean this high-level set of stuff that the product owner kind of like mentioned in a meeting. It doesn't mean a bunch of things that take me weeks and weeks and weeks to build. A backlog is like a really specific thing in Scrum. And most of the time when I see organizations trying to adopt Agile, either for lack of having a product owner or lack of being able to get consensus or lack of whatever, right? Very seldomly do I see teams with great backlogs. Okay? How many people feel like their teams have great backlogs consistently across the organization? Okay? What's fascinating about that, nobody raised their hand just for the record, right? So what's fascinating about that is that the backlog to me is the fundamental precondition for doing Scrum, right? It's the whole thing that first ceremony of sprint planning is based on. The team sits down with the product owner, gets clarity on what we're supposed to build, right? It has all their questions answered, right? They inspect it, right? They figure out, right? They figure out if it meets the invest criteria, all the different things. And then if they're being super prescriptive about it, then they might spend some time by themselves. They might break some things down into tasks, probably going like to Mike Cohn's Agile estimating and planning back in the days. And so break things down into tasks, and then they start doing daily stand-up meetings around it. If that team does not have a great backlog, what happens, right? They're basically doing backlog decomposition in sprint planning. Okay? And then they try to figure out how big this stuff is. And then they try to break it down and they don't know. And then after like 2 or 3 hours of sitting there doing that, they get tired of it. They say, let's take a break. And then they go, okay, well, you guys just go over there and work on that. We're going to go do something else. And then they get back together 2 or 3 days later and they try to say, okay, this is what we're going to do in the sprint. And then at that point, they haven't collaborated. They haven't figured out how to do the work. There's not really a great foundation for swarming on the work and getting things done. And you end up with like 7 or 8 people on the team all doing their own thing. Does that ever happen to anybody? Yeah, that's because the backlog sucks, right? It's all because the backlog sucks. What organizations underestimate is the amount of time and energy that it takes for anybody to produce a backlog with that level of granularity. So what they do is they give up and they say, okay, team, you just go figure it out, do something, right? Stay busy, okay? So failure to produce a really solid backlog is the #1 failure mode in Scrum, my opinion. I think a lot of every other dysfunction on a Scrum team is a result of that. Okay? Next thing is a team. A team in Scrum is everything and everyone necessary to produce that working tested increment of software. Okay? What is in the backlog, the ideal Scrum team is supposed to have everything necessary. Now, can we accommodate a DBA that we have to coordinate with every couple of sprints? Cool, right? Tech writer we got to pull in sometimes. Yeah, sure, right? So I'm not being super dogmatic. But if on the whole, that team does not have the ability to produce what's in the backlog, you know what's going to happen? They're never going to stabilize velocity. Okay? We're never going to know, right? So on the one extreme, people are saying, well, we just don't know, right? So let's not do estimates, right? Or let's do Kanban, right? Because that doesn't force the iteration, right? I'm not making fun of any of that stuff, but that's the solution to the problem, like break Scrum. And what I'm suggesting is that the root of the problem is the fact that the team has too many pieces necessary to deliver that don't exist within its team, okay? And what I just said, to me, it just feels inarguable, right? If you've got a team that doesn't have what it needs and it can't get it, that team is going to sit there and flounder. They're going to just do stuff, and they're never going to get to a definition of done. They're never going to have within their span of control the ability to actually produce the software. Okay? It just feels like just crazy simple to me. Working tested software. Why is working tested software so important? This to me is like what Scrum is totally predicated on. If I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of the team, then I can start to anticipate how far that I'm going to get through the backlog within a predetermined number of sprints, or how many sprints it's going to take to get through the backlog. Fair? Right? If we don't know the size of the backlog, and we don't know the velocity of the team, you have no idea when you're going to be done. Is that fair? It's just inarguable to me, right? Hey, we're on track, right? All the t-shirt sizes seem to be kind of flowing through the system, right? How many t-shirts, whatever, you know, I'm just like, give me a number, right? Need to know, right? I think this kind of stuff is knowable, okay? But I think sometimes the impediments to doing it are tough, okay? We're going to go there after a couple slides, right? So at scale, and I would suggest that this is true of less, it's true of SAFe, it's true of disciplined agile delivery, it's true of any homegrown methods for scaling. At some point in time, what scaling means is that I have more than one team necessary to deliver the product. Right? In an ideal world, right, if it's 3 or 4 teams and everybody's pretty close to each other and they're all kind of working on a well-architected congruent project, or they're fungible across the entire backlog, it'd be awesome to have like 4 teams, everybody's operating off of a single backlog, we get together, we do a scrum of scrums every day or so, right, life's good, okay? But what about when those 4 teams have, there's services teams or component teams, and they have dependencies between them and cross-cutting concerns. And now it's not 4 teams, but it's 10 teams or 100 teams, right? And we have to figure out how all of this stuff starts to work together, okay? So when you start talking about scale, what you're fundamentally talking about is, where does an integrated backlog come from? How do I balance capacity and demand? How do I make economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources? That's what's being done, right? So Less has a way of doing that, SAFe has a way of doing that, Disciplined Agile Delivery has a way of doing that, Nexus has a way of doing that. And so what you guys have to figure out is, are those scaling techniques, those ways of governing, are they going to produce the results that you desire, that your executives desire? Okay? Maybe, maybe not, right? But that's what we're doing. We're basically coordinating work across multiple teams. Single product owner metaphor will not do that. That's why SAFe is introducing all of the overhead, okay? Because it's basically acknowledging that these dependencies and multiple points of views exist, okay? Less is kind of saying, hey, this is how you scale if you have no dependencies and continuous integration and fungible teams across the stack, right? All kinds of different things, right? So every methodology for scale is making its own set of assumptions about the environment. I would suggest, now I'm probably overusing the word structure here, but most organizations end up being kind of networks of teams. Okay, so there's different teams for kind of different things in the organization. Okay, so that in most companies that we go into is a discoverable pattern, right? It's kind of like a Conway's Law kind of thing, right? It's like the organization reflects, the communication patterns, or the technology reflects the communication patterns of the organization that built it, right? And so you can go in and you can see how the organization is architected and if it's going to help us achieve our goals. And I think it's possible to design an organizational infrastructure that actually helps us take components, build them up into systems, connect things together on more like an assembly line kind of way, okay? Go deeper into that in a little bit. So the idea of metrics and tooling and things like that. Why are all the tool vendors out here, right? Why do we care about metrics? Why do we care about measuring progress? Because at the end of the day, the performance of a single team in these complex systems is not an indicator of progress. We can build great software in a team, but if that doesn't roll up into a car coming off the production line, it doesn't count. Right? It just doesn't count. And so what we have to figure out is, how are we measuring production capacity across the entire value stream at some point? Okay? So teams, backlogs, working tested software become structure, governance, and metrics at scale. SAFe, Less, Disciplined Agile Delivery, all of these are just specific instantiations of structure patterns, governance patterns, metrics patterns. Fair? Right, so we're extracting the simplest pattern we can out of all the noise, okay? What gets in the way? This is what's hard. And this is what I think that we need to be more direct with our executives on. The idea that we're going to start doing Agile, it's going to expose the impediments, and that the impediments are going to get resolved by a Scrum Master, in most organizations at scale, is a fallacy, right? Might resolve local team issues, but what about when the issues cannot be resolved by the team? What about when they require millions of dollars investment in new infrastructure, or going to the cloud, or refactoring your legacy mainframe, right? Those are the things, right? So when you look at the barriers to doing Agile, right, this is just a sampling of them. This was like the top 8 that came to my mind when I was building this slide a couple years ago. Matrix organization, non-instantly available resources, too much work in progress, limited access to subject matter expertise, shared requirements between teams, technical debt and defects, low cohesion, tight coupling, large products with diverse technology stacks, right? On and on and on and on and on. So you overlay Scrum as a set of practices on top of this, what's going to happen? Right? You're going through the motions of Scrum, but nobody can deliver anything. Okay? What if I tell people, hey, you just need to collaborate and work out your challenges and inspect and adapt and do retrospectives and figure out, but you're like, I got like 46 other teams. There's like, I keep saying 46 because we actually worked with a bank that had 6 like web teams that were all really loosely coupled and like could do Agile or Safe or whatever really well, but they had like 46 external dependencies in the environment that they had to coordinate with to get anything done. So they're doing great Safe, right? But it takes a year and a half to get anything into market still. Okay? That's not Agile, right? That's not agility. It might be doing Safe, right? It might be doing Scrum. And it was because of these systematic challenges within the organization. Where we're kind of at in market, right? We do a lot of executive level sales, which means that we just inherently have a smaller client base, and we're really trying to solve a certain class of problem. So a lot of times we'll go into an organization with an existing coaching staff or an existing consultancy in there, and I've got all these great, awesome coaches that care deeply about trying to do this. And they're just telling me, I've got this problem, I got this problem, I got this problem, I got this problem, I got this problem. And all they're doing is running around hacking at leaves, right? Trying to make it better. Right? I think it's a solvable problem, right? I don't think Agile at that level is going to actually make systematic differences in the organization. At least not that hit our predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, and product fit, right? Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second, because that's kind of like money slide, right? What do you guys think? I'm gonna do a time check. Okay, wow, quarter till. We're doing good. Yeah. Yeah.
Some are known, but not talked about. And then actually have the leaders commit to solving those
Cool.
impediments.
Yeah, that's kind of what it takes.
Long time too, but they
Yeah.
have to understand that they can't blame the teams for not delivering in
Yeah.
the method they expect them to
Yeah.
deliver when they've got something like this.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So the question becomes, is if it is a multi-year kind of transformation program to actually remove these impediments and make the changes, how are you going to measure whether that investment is actually yielding the results that we want, right? Because it just feels like a big black box until you're done, right? A little bit, right? And so again, right, we just kind of, we oversell often the ability of Scrum to fix these kinds of things, yeah.
Yeah, just to add on to what she said, so removing the impediments, the metrics really are, to your automotive example, are the final product
Yep.
throughput.
Yep.
So are we,
Yeah.
increasing our throughput?
Yeah.
We do it quicker, faster, better.
Yeah. So where I'm going to kind of pivot off of this is that in most organizations, I think you can create a hypothetical organizational design that would at least, in theory, at some point resolve all these things, right? So the pattern becomes, it's like if we could organize this thing however we wanted to, how would we form teams at all different levels of the organization? How would we coordinate the work? How would we do this, right? But now we've got all these impediments, so then you start asking yourself the question, what can I do today? What can I do 3 months from now? What can I do 6 months from now? And what will the state of the system look like? One of the big debates we have internally is that like I don't want to go like super deep into this right now, but like step 1 in the process doesn't look a bit like the Agile we want, right? Because the Agile we want is impossible in an organization that is full of this kind of stuff, right? If we're going to achieve those executive goals, right? So again, right, that's just kind of my point of view on this. So my belief is that my theory of transformation is that Agile, adopting Agile, doing an Agile transformation is at its core about the systematic process of forming teams, building backlogs, and producing working tested software. At its core, that's the only thing that I care about. I don't care about product owners, scrum masters, how you write user stories, how you do tech practices, right, whatever. What I find is that most organizations can kind of figure that out if you anchor on the principle. Every team has to be complete and able to deliver what it's responsible for. Every team has to have a clear, well-written backlog, and every team has to have the ability to produce a working tested increment at the end of the sprint. Those are the 3 core non-negotiables. As we start to scale, we have to start being very intentional about structure and governance and metrics and how all of those teams are going to interact. I believe that we need to have a hypothesis for that interaction. I believe these hypotheses are generally knowable. The patterns are beginning to emerge. Okay, it's not a total crapshoot. I think we can have some intentionality around it. Then what we want to do is we want to say is that anything that gets in the way of doing teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics is an impediment to the transformation. And removing those impediments is what it takes to transform the organization, right? So I can't tell you, again, right, how many organizations I walk into and I'm meeting with the coaching team and I'm like, show me what your coaching plan is. And they're like, oh, well, we've got to get Scrum Masters identified, and then we've got to get people trained, and we've got to get these things, and we've got to document how we're going to do portfolio governance. And it's all these activities, right? The work of the transformation, the measurable work of the transformation is teams formed, backlogs built, working tested software, able to be produced, the systems of control kind of around it, or the systems of enablement, if you like that word better, and then the measurable succession of removing impediments and watching those teams get better over time at what they can do. Yep, go for it.
Where's the correlation tied to outcome? Right, the whole reason that you're doing this in the first place is to solve complex business issues
Yeah.
and productivity. Right?
Yeah.
So the transformation's fine, but if it's not solving your problem,
Yeah, sure.
it's worthless.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So we talk about this internally too. There's like, it's almost like, and where I want to go is like, it's like a leading indicator, lagging indicator kind of metaphor, right? So we say we need better predictability. Our hypothesis is that Agile is going to get us there. And then we'll either have better predictability or not. We can decide how to measure that. Fair? Okay? So then I go, and now I'm like dealing in step 2. I go, how is Agile going to solve this problem, right? I'm going to form teams. I'm going to build backlogs. I'm going to produce working tested software. I'm going to instantiate this. I'm going to get them to a level of predictability by doing these things. And then in 3 to 4 months, I'm going to measure whether they are more predictable. Okay? That's doable, right? Now, there's probably goals even beyond that. Why do I need to be more predictable? Well, I want to level my stock price, or I want to convince our customers that we can make and meet commitments, and I want them to buy from us, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of like bigger things that you can roll out. But one of the things that we have on our mind a lot lately is how do I take the business's goals to the hypotheses? How do I validate the hypotheses? How do I get the learning? How do I show intermediate progress, right? All those kinds of things. And so again, there is a set of bets that we're making. When we decide to invest in Agile, we're making a bet that these processes are going to fix the business thing that we need to fix. Where my beef is that in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of organizational dysfunction, leading with culture and expecting self-organization, I don't think is going to necessarily remove those things. Teaching people to do a daily stand-up meeting and collaborate better, I don't think is necessarily going to remove these things. But I believe that if we form complete cross-functional teams, we get really specific about what does it mean to build backlog, we enable through refactoring or whatever it needs to do to get them to a point they can produce a working tested increment, then we should be able to measure predictability. I don't think anything else is going to give us a validatable hypothesis on the other side, or at least connect enough dots to get people to see how to get there. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious on your thoughts on the role of structure and governance and the relationship between that and like the enterprise project management office.
Yeah. So the question is what's the role between structure and governance in the enterprise project management office? I'm going to say just one thing. So I think there's a difference between project management and project managers. Okay? And then you kind of have to say, okay, is your EPMO, is it a governing body or is it like an advisory support body? Right? I mean, there's like all kinds of layers of onions that you have to peel to really answer your question. I think there's a role for project managers once you get outside the team level, right? And we're coordinating across value streams. I might not call them project managers. I might call them value stream coordinators or something like that, or program coordinator. Again, there's all kinds of different things. So I'm generally okay with somebody operating as a steward to make sure that work is moving through the system and gathering metrics and things like that. I'm okay generally with a named group of people, making sure that some minimum standards of kind of how things move through the system are being enforced and stuff's kind of communicating up. And so maybe I should expose another bias of mine, right? At the end of the day, I think you guys are probably clear by now, I'm not super concerned about whether we're doing Scrum right, okay? I'm not have like any like macro level kind of hold to say for any of these patterns. Agility to me is about the ability to get things in market fast and get feedback. Okay? That's to me is what the core of agility is. And so if we are managing a system that allows us to get things in market fast and get feedback and start to sell them and start to generate dollars and right, all those kinds of things we want at the team level, then that's agility to me. Right? I think in the right kind of organization with the right kind of stuff, I think you could theoretically have an EPMO that was like a healthy thing. As commonly implemented, probably not, right? But that's a very situationally specific thing. Okay? Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, can you back up to the previous slide?
That one?
Too far?
Oh, too far, okay.
No.
That one?
I think that's scale. That's the one.
Okay. Cool. Just wanted to like take a note. Okay, cool, got it. Cool, yeah,
All right, so, speaking of forward and big,
yeah.
architected systems, management, in my eyes, and I'm gonna simplify it, says, I want 10 pizzas.
You're what?
They want 10 pizzas.
10
But we
pizzas.
can deliver
Okay.
1 pizza every,
Okay.
90 days.
Okay,
They don't care that we got 1 pizza done, so they're like, when can I get it, when can I get
Sure.
it, right?
sure.
Now, on the other hand, they want to push this, minimum viable product out, but yet the organization's going, it's too much churn, it's too
Yeah.
much change. I
Yeah.
can't handle this, I don't know
Yeah.
how to train my people, I don't know, they think it's too volatile.
Yeah.
Now, what's your response to that?
So it might very well be, okay? So what I would suggest is that the system of delivery and the organization's goals are in conflict with each other, right? So to some degree, like I'm a real big believer in this idea of you have to be able to balance capacity against demand as a starting place. And when we talk about teams and backlogs, the velocity of the team is set by the team. The backlog is set by the product owner. The rate of completion establishes the capacity of the team. The backlog establishes demand, right? Scrum, sustainable pace, letting the team decide is all about establishing capacity and demand and bringing those two things in balance. At scale, right, we have bottlenecks and dependencies and there's more coordination. So governance is really, and that's the reason why I said it, making economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources, making sure that the teams are working on the highest priority stuff and that backlogs are funneling down to the team so they can establish stable velocity. Hold on a minute. So the challenge becomes, this is where you have managers that expect more than the team can do, okay? But you also have teams that aren't really good at making and meeting commitments, okay? So that the system design has to go something like this. If I demonstrate predictability, steady delivery, even flow, stable velocity, whatever you want to call it, at the execution level, can we agree that you won't put more into the system than the team has demonstrated the ability to produce? Because if you put more into the system than the team has the ability to produce, then the team's going to start thrashing and you're going to have quality problems and all kinds of different things. Okay? So like the first part of your question comes down to we have to negotiate the rules of the game in terms of balancing capacity and demand. And both sides have that to deal with, right? Once we've established the rate of flow that the organization can produce, right, then what we have to do now is we have to negotiate the actual frequency of delivery. So what we might do is if the organization can produce whatever it is that you're producing faster than the market can take it, then what we might have to do is we might have to have a batch and release kind of cycle, where maybe we do internal validation until we get to a critical mass, the business is ready to take it, and then we hand it off. At that point, what it sounds like is that the system of delivery on the IT side is not the constraint anymore, and maybe we need to figure out how to talk about how does the organization get better at putting things in market. Right? So again, you just have to peel back the onion and go to first principles all the time. One of the things that I'm really big on is I don't think we can try to solve impossible problems, and I don't think that we can do irrational things and expect good results. If somebody literally has 10 times more work in the system than their capacity to deliver, then that is fundamentally a problem. And no amount of Agile Scrum is going to actually make that a whole lot better. Is that fair? Yeah, go ahead.
So your stable velocity really depends on having stable teams as well, right?
Everybody's stable velocity depends upon having stable teams.
And I mean, there's a new initiative, people are looking at winning team
Okay?
constantly, and so that kind of throws that out the window. So
It
what do you
does.
do in the face of that?
Yeah, don't reteam. I'm serious. I'm not even joking, right? There's a big part of this that is organizations are organized around the wrong things. Okay? Well, the reason why you're reteaming is because you're organizing your organizational metaphor as projects. Right? A project gets approved, you spin up a team to deliver the project, and then when the project's over, they all go off and do everything. Right? That's probably not awful for long-lived projects with dedicated teams. No?
That's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm talking about allowing team members to actually choose what project or what initiative or, feature they're working on themselves.
If it was a super mature, stable system with expert developers and you had good continuous integration deployment, right, everything like super clear backlogs, right, yeah, sure, right, in an idealized state, anything less than that, you will absolutely destabilize velocity and not become predictable.
You don't have to convince me.
Oh, no, okay, yeah.
I'm an advocate, but I'm just wondering how those two go.
Yeah, well, so that's the interesting thing, and that's the reason why I run around the country and I do these talks and I anchor on these three things. It's like, if you want stable velocity, you have to keep teams together. Has anybody have examples of teams that are like constantly in churn that stabilize their throughput? Yeah, see? You raised your hand too early on that one, huh? Yeah. Anybody else? Right? So here's the thing, right? If it doesn't matter when you're done, or your output doesn't have to be integrated with anybody else's output, or if you're an entrepreneur and you're just building stuff, right? Do whatever you want, right? I'm not saying everybody has to do this. All I'm suggesting is that if your goal is predictability, you want to be able to bring capacity and demand into balance, velocity is the only anchor we have for that. If velocity isn't stable, I'd suggest you don't know the capacity of the team. If you don't know the capacity of the team, you don't know how much work that team can get through. You will never stabilize a system unless you do these things.
But what do you say, I mean, I'm an Agile coach, by the way, and I
Cool.
frequently face executives and leaders who
Yep.
say, we need to get to a higher velocity. What do you say to people like that?
Yeah, this is really taking an interesting turn. I'm going to answer the question and then maybe one more and then I'm going to move on. So what do you do when they say the velocity needs to be higher? Think about what the core of that question is. I have more product to build than I have capacity to build it. Okay? One of the funniest conversations I ever got into, and this was like a legit team had 10 times more to do than they could do. And they had hundreds of thousands of dollars of penalties for like every month they were late. And I would say, okay, we've been working together for a while. What's your velocity? X. What's your demand? 10x. Okay, which 10% do you want to focus on? Right? They said, but we have to do everything. And I went, you just told me you can't do everything. Right? So either A, how are we going to get the team's velocity higher? What improvements can we make? Or how can we shrink the size of the backlog? Well, we can't raise the velocity, we're going as fast as we can, and the backlog can't have anything taken out of it. Okay, then what 10% do you want to do? We have to do everything. Just told me you couldn't do everything, right? But we have to. And then what I came to, right, we're laughing, right? And so one question that I've started asking rooms full of people, I go, is it safer politically here to say yes and fail, or to say no and deliver? Because now you're not dealing with how does Agile work. You're dealing with how does the politics in your organization work, and what am I most likely to get punished for and lose my job? They're playing a game of chicken, right? And so that's broken, right? So that's not the problem that we're fundamentally trying to solve. What we want to do, this is the reason why I focus on this system of delivery thing. We want to focus on how does the full stack of stuff operate and get into agreement about what does it mean to balance capacity and demand so we don't find ourselves having silly circular conversations. Because here's the deal, right? The reason why they believe they can do that is because estimates are soft. And developers tend to roll over and go, sure, I'll do it. Right? We don't have data to prove that this is indeed the capacity of the team against this backlog. Right? Here's the interesting thing. It doesn't make you popular politically in your company because what they like are the people that say yes and then have a good plausible story as to why they didn't do it. Right? That's reality, right? And so the question is that those are the things that we need to fix. Now here's an anchor back to our earlier concept. Is that culture? Yeah, sure, right? Are you going to go to that manager and say, hey, look, big bad manager, you're really being awful to the team. You just need to back off all these hundreds of thousands of dollars of penalties, and you just need to let the team do what the team's going to do. And then the leader goes, well, but okay, so sure, but when can I have it? I don't know. We're just going to go as fast as we can. We're going to use Agile. Well, so how many hundreds of thousands of penalties should I budget for? I don't know. We're just going to do the best we can, and we'll get there when we get there. You can't have that conversation, right? So at some point in time, we have to deal with the reality, right? And it's hard, right? You got to be brave sometimes, right? You got to tell the truth sometimes, right? Back in PMP, any PMPs in the room? You guys are brave. Awesome. Good for you. I used to be a PMP. And I let it lapse. Just because I just decided I just didn't want to lie about what credits and stuff I was getting every year. So, I mean, you guys all do it, right? I'm serious, right? Yeah. I got tired of doing that, right? So I just let it lapse. And plus, I don't need it anymore at this point. But there was like a code of ethics in that at the beginning. If you're a PMP, you have a code of ethics. It's like basically says, I'm going to tell the truth, right? I'm going to expose stuff. Right? I'm going to let people, my stakeholders know the status of this thing, right? And so this is the reason why I anchor so hard on this, right? Because, some of us in the Agile community, it's like we want the world to be different than it is, right? And this idealistic thing, right? We want to be able to have this feel good, everybody communicates and collaborates, all this stuff, but we're working in organizations that are like fundamentally broken, okay? So we have two choices, right? Go find a different job and go work for a little small company that actually can do that. Or fight the good fight and figure out how to untangle this mess. And so what I'm talking about is what our whole company's built on is we want to untangle the mess. And it's hard. And if you're going to do it, you need to have a plan. You need to have a point of view on what done looks like. And then we have to be able to go through and systematically start having these conversations and deconstruct and then be able to measure the progress that we're making. That's what this whole talk's about. So when you're in the situation, like at the small, it goes, how do I do Scrum if I don't have a product owner? You don't, right? By definition, it requires a product owner. How do I do Scrum without a Scrum Master? You don't, right? How do I get predictable if the product owner won't tell me what I need to build? You don't, right? How do I get to working tested software if I don't have testers on the team? You don't, right? Those are the things you have to fix, right? And that's what's hard, right? It's being real with the world and saying, look, you can't, and this is what's hard. I've been involved with several certification bodies. This talk is not going at all like where I thought it would. This is good, right? As long as you guys are having fun and, it's all good, right? Yeah, it's Agile, right? So it's all fun, yeah. So, yeah, thanks. So, what was I talking about? Where was I going? So I just totally lost my train of thought. Certification. I was involved with several certification bodies. The interesting thing about the PMP certification is that is a generic process that can be applied across any organization. It might work better in some organizations and not others, right? But it's a generic process that can be applied. Agile is not a generic process that can be applied in any organization. It requires change. Okay, and that's what makes it different. And that's why Scrum's certification is a little bit dangerous. It's why SAFe certification is a little dangerous. It's why the PMI ACP, which I was involved in, is dangerous, because we're teaching people a process that is not generally applicable in every organization, unless the organization is willing to make the necessary environmental changes for that methodology to work. And that's what's unique, and that's why it's hard to certify. And once you're certified in it, that's why it's hard to implement. Right? It's all this stuff. That's the thing that we have to get better. And so what my big belief in all this is, and probably might be just like the big takeaway from this talk. If we believe that we can walk in and teach people Agile or encourage them to have a different mindset, and we don't intentionally deal with the underlying systems challenges in organizations, none of it's going to work. But if we do those things in conjunction with forming teams and starting to break dependencies and getting the environment better over time, and we're pragmatic about what day 1 looks like versus what day 30 looks like versus what day 180 looks like, then we've got a shot at winning because we have a strategy. And it's not like just train and pray. Somebody said that to me the other day, it's train and pray, right? And it's like if you want to do this, right, you have to understand and you have to bring the organizational impediments up to be first-class citizens. Right? That is the work of the transformation, and that's what this slide's fundamentally about. Or that slide. Or like the whole talk up till now, right? Okay, cool. Do a time check. How are we doing? Okay, 11:05. 35 minutes left. We've done good though, right? We've actually probably spent like 3 times longer on this set of materials than we needed to, but it's good stuff. Question?
The
Okay.
transformation often involves
Yep.
team management that often runs a multi-branch actually because they would like to be engaged, but they don't have the training. In the beginning you said they would like to now learn from the team how. What is your recommendation to keep them engaged in terms of continuous learning and education?
You're saying they want to do it, but they don't have the training? So how do we engage the execs to go to training? Okay. The short answer to that question is to give them training that is meaningful to them. Okay? We spend way more time and money than we should up front in the sales cycle educating executives on how to do this and how to think about the problem. I've been closely involved, not our transformations, with situations where an executive coach goes in and tells the room full of executives that they need to back off the team, leave them alone, empower them, and just let them go do their thing. And the executives are like, get out of here, right? Executives don't need Scrum training. They don't, right? What they need fundamentally, and this is, we're going to get into this just a little bit, but I am at this stage, I'm going to run out of time, ironically, right? So the challenge becomes is that what they need is to understand the relationship between business architecture, technology architecture, organizational design, how dependencies impede flow. They need to understand how the systematic, specific changes you're making in the organization are actually going to make their economic outcomes better. You need to tell them how, if they give you $3 million to hire coaches, how they're going to get at least $4 to $6 million in return within what performance period, right? It's insulting to bring a room full of executives that are running billion-dollar companies and teach them Scrum and tell them to leave their teams alone, right? But we do that all the time. Right? And to them, they just go, this is nonsense, right? So that's the hardest thing of building any kind of consultant practice, and we live this all the time. It's like, how do you get people that have empathy for the executive and are telling that story, right? It's not about making, and this is going to sound harsh, but it's not about making the developer's life better. We know if we do these things, it will, right? But that's not the value prop to these guys to make an investment. Unless you can directly connect how their lives being better actually makes better product, faster in market, right? Those kinds of things. Again, right, need to be more specific in step 2. If I do this, how do I believe that it's going to achieve that outcome? Okay? So I'm going to hit a couple things just to like anchor this down just a little bit so you walk out of here and you go, okay, like maybe there's something like actionable up underneath this. So what you'll see in some of this, right, you'll go, oh, does this look like SAFe? Yeah, maybe, right? Because SAFe is built on patterns, right, that Dean has put instantiation of process around. Less is built on patterns that they've instantiated process around. The patterns are generally something like this. There's almost always at the bottom some sort of shared component layer. I would love to have full stack fungible teams that could operate anywhere in a large system. Most of the time at scale, that's not going to happen, right? So generally you have stuff that is consumed, and then you have stuff that is being, right, consumers and, right, and suppliers, I guess is probably the way to say it, right? So you have like services layer, right? Because we want one view of the customer, we want one set of functions to do this, right? Microservices kind of a world, right? And then we have more front-end stuff that goes in and consumes those services. So in general, the pattern is that you can walk into an organization and you can say, what are the pieces that are going to be shared that operate across contract boundaries, right? What are the business capabilities that they support? Who are the business people that care? What's the team that delivers it? What's the technology encapsulation strategy, right? All those things, right? And you can build like a service type team. Okay? Most large organizations at scale have some number of services-oriented teams. Okay? And then above that are generally like the more customer-facing kinds of teams, right? The teams that are going to consume services. So I tend to think of those like feature teams, right? They're more like that's like the most prototypical Scrum construct. So if the services were never changing, right? These Scrum teams would just be Scrum teams, Scrum teams, Scrum teams, Scrum teams. They go consume a service. If you've got great shared code ownership, you know that things aren't going to break, right? Technology is consistent. Maybe that Scrum team goes and consumes a service. But in a lot of organizations at scale, you got a services team and you got a feature team. Okay? So that pattern exists, right? Whether it's applicable or not to use, different story. Then the next pattern up is like what I would consider like a program team kind of construct, right? SAFe has a specific implementation of that, LESS has a specific implementation of that. But generally what I find is that in large multi-team kinds of initiatives, the single product owner metaphor is insufficient to deal with the complexity of the backlog. Okay? An individual product owner down here at the services team level cannot make cross-cutting decisions often across the whole stack. Each feature team cannot make cross-cutting decisions across the whole stack. So what often happens is that we create some sort of coordinating entity that does some level of upfront planning, small batch, rolling wave, progressive elaboration kinds of things, right? Not big upfront planning, but they're attending to the things that are across the organization and managing the flow of work to respect the bottlenecks that are down here. You can only mock and stub for so long before somebody's way ahead of somebody else and you're never going to catch up, right? So there's some level of backlog or bottleneck management that has to happen across multiple teams. At the top, there's usually some sort of team that is doing portfolio level governance. And all I mean by that is who breaks ties when I don't have enough, I don't have enough people to do the stuff, right? That kind of a thing. Economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources. Prioritization, right? Who gets to break the tie? Because in large organizations, there's multiple product owners across multiple things, and these guys down at the bottom are trying to balance all of that. Now, again, right, at scale, right, in a lot of like Amazon, Walmart Labs, right, there's a lot of big companies that have cracked this nut, right, through loose coupling, no technology dependencies, like deployment, right? It's a solvable problem. The question is can you do it that way, just right out of the gate? Okay, so generally there's like this pattern. And the way that I look at most organizations, this is gross oversimplification, but there is some number of product teams, some number of services teams getting coordinated by some number of program teams subordinate to some number of portfolio teams, okay? Almost always, this is kind of reference architecture level stuff, almost always, for me, I like to use Scrum at the bottom layer. I like to use Kanban across the middle to make sure that we're managing the flow of work across multiple teams. Lets us understand work in process, understand where bottlenecks happen, understand where you have latency, understand where it's the right place to go and improve, and then also Kanban at the portfolio tier. Okay? Metrics. Okay? Metrics these are arbitrary. This is just a starting place. So here's the deal. My hypothesis is that this stuff is often knowable based on the current business architecture, the current technology architecture, the current organizational architecture. The methodology and approach at these different levels can be negotiated and talked about up front. The dependencies between the teams are often very well understood, and we can assess the impact of them before we start. Okay? And I'm not saying big upfront design. I'm saying create a working hypothesis about where we're going. Right? Intentionally design the team-based structure such that once you have eliminated the organizational impediments and you've eliminated the dependencies, you will have the organization that you want. That's like an interesting thing, so I'm going to say it again. When you're thinking about how to set up your organization in advance, look towards the organization that you want, build for that, recognize the impediments and dependencies and things that are in the way, and then start to figure out how to move towards the organization. What we find is a lot of organizations, they start off with some hierarchy and some command and control and some very intentional pre-planning for the teams. But as you begin to make the organization better and as you begin to break dependencies, you can start to deprecate the control layers. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're making in Agile is we say Agile doesn't have any coordination or control outside the product owner. The reality is in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of complex organizations, we often need that. So what starts to happen is if we pull that out of the system before the system's ready to have it pulled out, then it becomes chaos. Right? So again, right, so tend to how we think about this. I've got a whole nother deck where I walk through this thing called 4 quadrants. We do expeditions and base camps and stuff like that to try to extend this metaphor. But quite often, the pattern is stabilize the system in the presence of constraints through kind of explicit, almost like project coordination. And then as we start improving it, we can start reducing batch size. We can start breaking dependencies. We can start changing how we do program and portfolio governance to make sure we're running small batches or team-based deliveries or services-based funding, right? All kinds of things. We can start to change our innovation and market strategies once we've been able to do that. Often, though, it's super hard to flip the switch all at one time. Okay, yes, sir.
Would you suggest that this structure best aligns with the software product line engineering paradigm?
Software, so this structure best aligns with the what?
Software product line engineering.
Software product line engineering. Is that a specific thing or just a general thing?
A general thing.
General thing? Okay, the way I'm going to interpret your question is that, does this lend itself more towards software organizations, or does it lend itself more towards like other kinds of things we might do with Agile?
Product line a la Lockheed Martin, say.
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure I know exactly how to answer your question, so I'm going to be just really honest that I'm going to answer something that I think I want to answer, and hopefully it'll get close, right? So, just being honest with you guys, right? So the pattern, so like I think I mentioned, right? So we've done some work with like marketing companies, hotel chains, fast food restaurants, things like that. The pattern that we typically see can be implemented in either non-IT products or in products that have mix of IT and physical goods and bigger supply chains, is that very often you can form a team type construct or a Kanban type construct for the delivery of the specific thing, right? The piece, okay? The coordination in the middle becomes very much like lean value stream and Kanban-based flow. What's the interesting thing is at the portfolio level, it often looks like very traditional project management because we need to understand when all the pieces have to come together at one time because the plans are very tightly coupled. So if you can mentally model this, right? So just like the whiteboard in your head, right? If I had a Gantt chart up at the top, that was kind of controlling the life cycle of the project. As you move through time, work drops down out of that and goes into a queue for processing. And then as work drops out of that, it goes to scrum teams that are sprinting. That actually works really well. But what you have to look at is you look at the top layer, not as like the gospel of the project plan, but you look at it as the world according to what needs to happen, right? Because a lot of projects, they need to be in market at a certain time. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know what needs to happen. That defines the backlog sequencing, right? That stuff drops down into a queue, gets processed, planned, worked out, sequenced, right? Then that gets dropped down into an execution team. What's cool about it, right? You have your plan, you have your processing layer in the middle, you have your execution layer. The rate of execution informs the middle layer informs the top layer, and we know where we're at against the project plan. Might be late, right? Doesn't guarantee success. That answer it at all?
Sir.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that wasn't totally awful response. Okay, good deal.
So the money slide, like it shows all the teams and then all the impediments.
Oh, yeah.
So is that stuff represented here? I'm having a hard time mapping.
Yeah, so,
Untangle all that.
yeah, so basically what I was suggesting, right? So I was kind of trying to bridge those two ideas together. Design for the organization that you want, okay? Acknowledging there's going to be gaps in membership, right? There's going to be dependencies between the entities, right? There's going to be stuff that has to be coordinated and controlled. It's not going to be a perfect world on day one, but organize for your end state, okay? Knowing that all those dependencies exist and they're first order citizens, right? Then what will start to happen is that early on, you're going to have to control that system more because you know that you've got all the dependencies and variation and missing parts of the system. Okay? So you're going to have to plan more than you would like to. Fair? You guys with me so far? So far. Okay, cool. So then these guys are getting as close to as possible to being able to do what they need to do, right, for where you're at now. And then you put together a plan for systematically breaking the dependencies, systematically filling the gaps in the team, systematically starting to change hearts and minds.
So what does
right?
that look like?
Yeah, so I don't have a slide for it, but it's doable, okay? What it looks like, there's a, shoot, I can't pivot into a different deck. I'm not even gonna try, I'll just like be a total cluster. But so it looks a little bit like the metaphor where I was going with this is that like when you do a pilot, okay, and Agile is not a Scrum team, right? It's useless in my opinion to pilot Scrum. Scrum works, right? We just know it. Give Scrum the right conditions, Scrum will work. What we need to pilot is we need to pilot the full stack, the structure, the governance, the metrics, everything, in the presence of those kinds of dependencies. So what that work looks like, there's usually 5, I don't know why I do this, I do this all the time, there's 4, or there's 5 or something, right? So there's 5 things that we like look at as far as like high level sequencing. We call them base camps in our world. And I go, first thing we want to do is stabilize the system. Next thing we want to do is we want to reduce batch size. Third thing we want to do is break dependencies. Fourth things we want to do is team-based funding, like get them to stop approving projects and give dollars to teams to achieve certain outcomes. And then the last one tends to be more innovation focused, like we're not even asking you to do something specific, we're asking you to do something that's innovative, right? That kind of a thing. So you can put together a high level sequencing of various end states that you want to be in. Within those end states are things like, okay, by week 2, we're going to form the teams. By week 4, we want to have a pretty good, solid backlog starting to emerge. By week 6, we want to make sure that we've got a very good idea of the cost of the dependencies and we've made economic justification for starting to break them. And then we want to make sure that we've got a pretty good, solid release plan emerge. And then we want to make sure that we've got stable velocity and we've made the right system improvements. And then, so you can like start to untangle when you kind of get past this like emergent self-organization thing and you actually have teams you're tracking towards, you understand the dependencies. Now we can say, okay, in the first 4 months, we're going to try to stabilize, but we're going to try to stabilize by forming these 4 teams, these 2 coordinating entities, this portfolio, and this is what it needs to look like every 2 weeks for the next 4 months. And that pattern, what we found over the last 7 years, it's pretty universal. It holds. How long does it take? I don't quite know. Exactly what do you need to train every team? I don't know, right? What are the exact impediments in the organization? Situationally specific, right? But the pattern, the sequence of events and the outcomes you're trying to get to are pretty, they're almost the same every time.
So that's part of what I think we need to hear as part of, here's what we're going to be doing as we come in, right? It's not
Yeah.
just, organizing development teams, but organizing a whole system according to a plan.
Yeah, the hardest thing that I have to do as we onboard new coaches is to go, okay, yes, every day you are going to be training people and doing workshops and coaching them and helping make organizational improvements and all that kind of stuff. But all of that activity has to be leading towards these intermediate outcomes. All of the intermediate outcomes have to be going towards base camp 1, which is predictability. Right? The predictability has to be measured based on, this is what it was before, couldn't make it meet any commitments, now we can make it meet commitments 3 months at a time, right? Against a known backlog, right? That kind of a thing. And then, right, then I kind of look at it, it's up to the organization, okay, we're predictable, now what do you want to focus us at, right? And so it's the idea that activity rolls up into intermediate outcomes, which roll up into measurable business outcomes, which actually then get applied into the organization. And that's kind of the crux of this. And the reason why I go through so much like pre-stuff to be able to say it is because if you believe that it's emergent and culture driven, you can't do this. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any thoughts and comments around distributed global teams?
Distributed or dispersed?
Both.
Okay. Okay. Just 11:40. I think we're probably at a good spot. I think we can just do questions and answers. I think you guys get where I'm going. I think anything else would probably open up way too many other streams. So this is where I always go back to when I answer this question. Okay? As I say, when all of this lightweight stuff, has anybody ever read like Alistair Coburn's Crystal Clear book? The early stuff with Highsmith, right? This is where I think sometimes we're missing, like, I feel really fortunate. I got into Agile like around 2004, 2005, and all of the early books were still like in heavy circulation. And I was reading Alistair's stuff and Mary Poppendieck's stuff and early David Anderson and Jim Highsmith and these guys. And so these early thinkers were basically saying is that this lightweight methodology, this osmotic communication, right? This ability to do all this lightweight stuff is predicated on us being in the same room and overhearing conversations, right? Just is, right? So if I focus on the 3 things, teams, backlogs, working tested software, and I say, okay, I have distributed and dispersed teams, right? Teams all over the globe. We know, just inarguable, that the osmotic communication postulated by Alistair and being talked about is not going to happen, right? People aren't going to overhear conversations. They're not going to overhear the conversation with the product owner, right? So what tends to happen is that the more dispersed you are, the more that you're going to rely on specification. I think that's inarguable, okay? Because if people aren't there to hear the conversation, I was in a situation where I had a QA person that was like in this pod. It was like early when I was still working in companies. And I was in this pod, and we got like one extra developer, and she basically got the boot and went and sat on the other side and QA. Like all of a sudden, the whole communication pattern in our pod broke down. And she wasn't even in India in a different time zone. She was on the other side of the building. Okay? So what starts to happen is if you're not co-located, you have to be more specific about what you want, usually in writing. Not saying a formal spec, it could be a whiteboard, it could be a document, it could be something in Slack, it could be all kinds of things, but you have to be more specific. So this is, again, right, why I like to go back to what makes this stuff work. Right? There's nothing magic about a daily stand-up that makes Agile work. There's nothing magic about a review and retrospective that makes Agile work. There's fundamental principles that this stuff is founded on. If you want to do lightweight specifications written on story cards, physical cards, using like, whatever, method you choose, right? Then people have to be in the room. If you're going to have distributed teams, you're probably going to have to use some sort of tool, and you're going to have to write more stuff down. And you're more likely to have miscommunication and latency and things go slow, right? Tons of technology now that can reduce some of that, but it's inarguable, my opinion. Did that answer your question?
What I wanted to
Okay.
get a level higher.
Okay.
I get,
Okay.
gotta be more specific.
Okay, same thing. It just goes up a level.
But the management team
Yeah.
often
Crossfire.
interpretation and what are you delivering?
Yeah, so that's where this middle tier comes in. You have to solve that, right? I mean, you have to have an explicit agreement, right? So it's going to be like these managers that are putting people in the crossfire are going to have to agree to come together on a regular cadence and to make decisions about what is most important. And they're going to have to agree on what they're asking the teams to do. And they're going to have to make economic trade-offs. And so in your case, I don't know if that's at like the portfolio level or if it's the requirements definition level, but we need a system to resolve that. Generally, it's some sort of coordinating entity that has ownership of the backlog, at least at a high level, and is working to feed things to the team. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's not specific enough for you?
no, I just want to be clear. I'm softballing some questions because there's
Oh, that's okay. Okay, that's cool. And I just want to be clear, I'm not frustrated. I'm just like trying to be hyper specific so that I can, as specific as I can be in such a general audience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just want to be clear to make sure I understand you. You're not saying this is like the perfect ultimate design.
It's a pattern.
It's like a pragmatic design based on just the problems that you're going to find in a typical
Yep.
enterprise when you start.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's not like a 12th slide when you kind of reach Zen and this is what it looks
Well, so again, right, Zen is like, I mean, think about it, right? It's the Holy Grail. I've got 8 people all working on a common business problem, single product owner, able to produce something working tested that they can put in market and get feedback on it all the time, right? That's the Holy Grail. We understand the Holy Grail. Okay? And your end state can be whatever you want it to be. It can be team level scrum, it can be less, it can be safe, it can be whatever you're shooting towards, right? Is perfectly fine. Okay? It's the intermediate patterns that I don't think we're talking about enough. How do we get there, right? So when we talk about transformation, it's the reason why I started with this then step 2, right? We have this hypothesis, Agile's going to make it better, and we've decided now that that's safe. Okay, what are the steps to get there? If I teach people safe, is that going to make them more agile? I don't know, right? What's your hypothesis on how it's going to make them more agile? If I teach them to be more adaptive leaders and stand back and lead and just let their teams do their stuff, right? What's my hypothesis on how that action is going to yield the better business outcomes that we've promised, right? And the kind of the argument that I've been building is that most organizations, the environment that they're in are a mess. Okay? That mess has to be dealt with in order to get the improvements. Teaching people to change their minds or change their behavior is insufficient. You've got to change the ecosystem that they operate in for those behaviors and mindsets to have a home base. So the question becomes, how do you get there? And I would suggest that it's you design the system, recognize the dependencies and impediments that are in place, build coordination controls that respect those dependencies, and then anchor on the three things, right? Teams, backlogs, working tested software, to systematically begin improving the system so that you can actually take advantage of Agile methodologies and get the business outcomes from them. Because my belief is that if I were able to build a company from total scratch, a software company, well architected based on these patterns, it's a very doable thing out of the gate, right? The patterns for doing Agile at scale are very well understood. The question is what are we going to do to get from point A to point B and actually make the improvements? Okay, distributed teams, right? So if you can't take Scrum or Crystal or any of the stuff out of the box if you've got people all over the world, right? You're gonna have to amp up the level of communication somehow, either in writing, shared time zones, Slack, face-to-face, whatever it is, right? You're gonna have to amp up and intentionally deal with the level of communication. If you have architectural dependencies that are gonna prevent you from getting something done at the end of a 2-week sprint, you have to figure out how you're going to deal with that now, and then how you're gonna resolve that architectural dependency over time. If you don't have enough of the right subject matter expertise, what are you going to do to make sure everybody's got a good backlog today while you're building out the expertise to make sure you can move into the organization you wanna be in? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Are those teams 8-person, have all the skills on them?
Yeah,
Or are they like DBs?
Yeah, it's probably a more complicated kind of thing because I am not really trying to teach you a specific instantiation because I don't really believe in that. Like it could be like you could have delivery teams down at the bottom layer. Sometimes we'll build cross-functional teams of like people that, you know, like enterprise architects, sometimes the DB's up there. Sometimes you're modeling a longer value stream. So there's like stuff where like that collaborative team is working together to define. And then there's a build piece, and then sometimes there's a validate and deploy piece. But that's why we use small batches, lean, limiting work in process at that level, because it doesn't feel very much like Scrum, and cross-functional teams don't get to stay together all the time generally at that level. Yeah.
With kind of your earlier slide of approaching systems first,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes that has the largest financial or operational barrier of entry. What are some best practices around reducing that financial cost? You mentioned pets and dollars to bring in coaches and things like that. Is there other ways to maybe start that transformation without a huge financial?
Yeah, so generally what you've got to do is you've got to pick a slice of the organization that you can truly transform, and then get it to like a basic set of like predictability. Like that's usually a first step. So like my general bent, and remember when I say systems, I'm not talking about like technology, infrastructure investments, I'm talking about the system of delivery. And so pick a piece of the organization that is meaningful and that if we got it stable would prove the pattern. Right? So to me, it's about vertical slicing the organization instead of horizontal slicing the organization. So we vertically slice the organization. We put just enough effort in to prove that what we're talking about works, and then earn the right to do the next step. Earn the right to do the next step. Economically justify every step of the way. Because here's what you've got to do. Right? Whatever that investment you're entrusted with early on, you've got to say, look, I spent your money. I got this outcome from it, and you were better off in this way because of it. Now, I did what I said I'm going to do. Now let me go do the next piece. Let me go do the next piece. And you earn the right to go big at that point. I think tying the economics, the activities, and the intermediate outcomes to the big organizational goals, right, at the end of the day, that's fundamentally what this talk's about. This is just talking about like what are the underlying thinking patterns and barriers and like how you structure the work so that you can begin to do that. Right? Also, this idea, the step 2 hypothesis thing, right, I think is really big for me. It's like whatever hypothesis you make, tell me specifically what you're going to go do and how you're going to prove you did it. That's the big deal. Yeah.
And so appreciate a lot of the conversation.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff around the program and team level seems to be focused on the predictability outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
One of the contentions that I have with the safe aspect is it feels a little bit too IT focused or
Yeah.
software focused.
Yeah.
And so knowing drive a lot of that stuff, which
Yep.
is one of the original questions, is primarily driven outside of IT.
Yeah.
Right? Can you throw us a hypothesis around the portfolio teams that are above your
Yeah. So I've got a slide that we've been talking about for a while. Email me. I'll be happy to send it to you. But it's like the value streams at the top and the bottom. I'm not assuming are just IT value streams. Usually when we take a top layer kind of organization, it's really almost like their entire portfolio governance thing. It can be anything from ideation, to how do we validate, to how do we build, to how do we put in market, to how do we measure ROI. Down in the middle tier, it can be whatever level of decomposition work that needs to happen with the business and collaborating, very explicitly modeled. We can model the build in a value stream, and then we can manage the deployment and stuff in a value stream. If there's anything else that's outside that's necessary, then that can be modeled as well, right? So there's nothing in what I'm talking about that says this is IT only. The value stream, it can be the value stream. Right, there's a lot of places you go into, and I mean, you know this as well as I do, where the software development's only like 10% of the entire length from idea all the way to delivery. And if we can shorten that whole thing, right, then that's where we really win. Right? So again, nothing in this implies IT only, even though that's probably a lot of what we're talking about here.
So is value streaming one of your big tools for math?
Yeah, so I use that word because people anchor on it quite a bit. It's kind of well known from the safe stuff. To me, the way I like try to reduce everything to like really simple patterns. And I go down at the execution layer, whatever I'm asking people to build, they need to have everything and everybody necessary to do that. At the team level, that's a value stream, right? It's an encapsulated value stream. When we can't encapsulate something, we have to orchestrate it, right? So orchestration means that I'm going to coordinate across multiple value streams potentially. Okay? And so that value stream at the next level up can go as far left or as far right as you need it to be to encapsulate everything that has to happen in order to get that thing to done. And so that's, again, right, so I'll just say that's kind of an interesting angle that I don't think I hit. I talk a lot about encapsulation and orchestration. Scrum is predicated on the idea that the business is represented by the product owner, the team owns end-to-end delivery, and then they can produce something to a customer, right? So that's the value stream in Scrum. Where Scrum starts to break down is when that value stream is not encapsulated, right? It doesn't really have a solid orchestration method. So where SAFe has come along is it's basically said, okay, this is how we're going to orchestrate at the program level. This is how we're going to orchestrate at the portfolio level, right? But it's making assumptions about the encapsulation of the value stream at that level, right? So value stream, yeah, so you want to have a notional idea of what does it take to get it from idea to delivery. And and you can model it, right? You can model it in any of the major tools. Yes?
So you're talking about like sort of the first step is to sort of create predictability.
Mm-hmm.
So are there approaches you normally use when, oftentimes like so your 10x conversation, predictability is a little harder to achieve, right? Because like the wind is blowing really hard at the base.
Yeah.
So are there ways you can approach trying to carve out that predictability so you can get to your next step?
Yeah, so to me, predictability is a result of stable teams operating off of known backlogs, able to produce something working tested, balancing capacity and demand. So in the case that you're talking about, the example that you used from the talk is where I had 10x to do, and then how do I get some notional idea of what 10% we can actually. In that particular case that I was talking about, we did an exercise that was crazy with like 70 people in the room, mostly product management. And we had this idea of the team's capacity. We hadn't even started sprinting, but we had an idea of the team's capacity on this side. And then on this side, we put all the work that they were trying to get done in the next 3 months, and it was crazy. It was a crazy amount of work. And so we did there's some estimating things we did, really rapid estimating. And then I had them physically move the cards from this side to that side. And when they were full over here, then they couldn't move any more cards, right? This is what they were going to do. This is what they couldn't do. And they had like this funny, it's not funny, right? They had like this crisis moment when they started realizing, oh crap, right? We can't do it, right? So we created a exercise that helped them viscerally see that they weren't even in the game, right? It's not like, well, it's a little close, teams should just work hard, right? They were not in the game. Right, so I ended up being out the next day, and I came back, I think it was the following Thursday, and they had broken everything up into smaller pieces and rearranged things, and they got more higher value things the way they did it, but they were still only 10-20% of what they needed to get done.
Once they had gone through that exercise, were they more willing to commit to, okay, this is what we
Yes, but, right, it's really painful and it's led to a lot of very difficult conversations, right? Because the reality of the situation is that some executive at some level has promised somebody that, and they put their reputation on the line, often because you said you could do it, right? That's a really tough political situation to be in. It's so a lot of times our language as Agilist, it gets to the question you asked about training, our language as Agilist doesn't speak to that executive's current reality. And that's where you get into some of those hard conversations. Would you rather the team overpromise and underdeliver or tell you what they can actually do? I had one executive, product executive, who was putting so much pressure on the team. I said, I'm not even going to know. It's going to take us it's going to take us a while to figure out like even what the capacity of your team is and the size of your backlog. I said, stop asking them for dates because they don't know the answer. She goes, how long is it going to take for us to know the answer? And I said, probably 3 months. Think about 3 or 4 sprints, the time it takes to understand the backlog. And her comment, she's like, shoot me now, right? I am so screwed. Right? And then ultimately she ended up losing her job, right? And I don't know exactly the dynamics around the losing the job thing, but the problem was that she had overpromised the organization so much, feeling that she could just put pressure and get what she needed, and it wasn't working for anybody, right? But recognizing that those are incredibly human places to be, not that she was evil, she wasn't a bad person. It's just that she's trying to run the business and do things and make sales and all that kind of stuff. And the organization, it just gets crushed, right? You can't produce anything. So that's the reason why it's like Scrum just